Hello. Our story begins inside the capital city of Theed on Naboo. There have been two major reports to Coruscant from the planet, the first of which being the revelation that the royal house of Palpatine was found slaughtered in their home. Everyone was dead, except for the boy, the son of the aristocratic family, who escaped the murder scene. The second report forwarded to the Jedi Temple came from the Gungan Jedi, who felt the disturbance. The Jedi Master reported on a highly sensitive being on the planet, someone who happened to be within the city. Though communication from the Gungan Jedi had since gone silent, no one knew it yet, but he had been gutted by Plagueis the Wise in an alleyway. The Gungan's body wouldn't show up for another several days after traveling downstream. When he'd be discovered, his lightsaber would be missing. Grandmaster Yoda, who was working off of a nearby planet called Enarch, was the first to respond. His mission to the other world wasn't nearly as important or dire as this. He was simply teaching a bunch of orphans how to accept found family. It was important, and Yoda believed it as such, but the death of a powerful family and the high midichlorian count were enough to draw him away. He had every intention of returning to Enarch when all of this was said and done, which he didn't anticipate would last very long anyways. This perhaps was the irony in all of this. Returning to Naboo for a murder was important, but the Jedi chose an aristocratic family over a bundle of orphans. And sure, the orphans were fine and protected, but the sudden need to leave and be a hero outlined who the Jedi had become since the fall of the Nile. Yoda didn't really consider this. He was mostly just hoping to be of assistance. He was mostly also worried about the younger son of the family, who had now gone missing. He initially made the connection that Palpatine's son was the individual with the high sensitivity to the Force, because the Palpatines had always been hostile towards the Jedi, to say the least. No one ever found Sheev when he first started showing signs of the Force, but the House of Palpatine made sure he wasn't discovered by the Order. The patriarch of the family interacted with Jedi Masters on a few occasions. His frustration, outbursts, and so on towards them have been accounted for in mission debriefings. It was actually so hostile that the Jedi Council even knew who he was, just for the sake of avoiding him, in case any other missions took them out to Naboo or the surrounding systems. That wasn't a problem anymore, but Yoda also recognized that he would need to find the actual murderer or murderers, because people might assume the Jedi had done it. The Grand Master had seen the change throughout his life. When he was a Padawan, the Jedi were revered across the stars. Over the years, though, their public perception had become unfavorable. People didn't look to them with wonder, even on Naboo, where he currently walked. He could sense the frustration amongst the people. Seeing the caned Grand Master finally showing himself was an odd sight to see. Most people in the galaxy knew of a few Jedi inside the Order. Yoda was one of them. His recognition wasn't always a sign of popularity, though. While Naboo wasn't a struggling system, the people of the planet, aside from the reserved Palpatines and a few other houses, were very humanitarian-based. There were some fundamental issues between the Naboo and the Gungans, but it didn't stop the people of Theed from seeing the Jedi as forgetful sages, only focused on their dealings in the Senate. If the wealthy world of Naboo saw them that way, then imagine how lower income or unprotected systems felt. Yoda was guided by members of the Queen's security team. Because these were aristocrats killed, the Queen was directly involved. Yoda followed around the Naboo guard as they led the Jedi Master into the Palpatine Manor. He walked around. The bodies were long removed, but their outlines and the murder weapons left behind. Yoda looked at some holograms popped up, displaying the people's final resting places. The first thing he noticed was the lack of aggression. It was vicious, but it wasn't an attack that came from an adult. Yoda didn't make the assumption that the boy did it, but it wasn't a good look. Yoda paced around the manor, with members of the royal security team continuing their own investigation. There was a member of the squad shadowing Yoda to make sure he had any questions answered, but he didn't have anything to ask. Instead, Yoda just continued to walk about. His saddened expression is really all anyone saw from him. He hated needless loss of life, and while the elder Patriarch Palpatine would have hated such sympathy, it was who Yoda was. He felt terrible for this family. All of them except their child were dead, and that became Yoda's greatest interest. Who was that survivor? Why did they survive, and what did they see? Yoda noticed some other death circumstances. things that seemed abnormal for a regular citizen. He didn't want to jump to any conclusions, so he wasn't doing that, but something was certainly awry. After walking through the entire manor and getting a clearer picture of everything, he stepped out of the house. He knelt on the front patio and meditated. Yoda naturally hoped that the Force would give him some direction, a place to put his trust, but he couldn't be sure. He could sense some sort of great deception surrounding this murder. Whether the murderer had been deceived or the investigators, he remained confused. However, Yoda wanted to know more about one other thing: the Gungan Jedi Master, who had last communicated with the Jedi from a hidden location on Theed. The transponder was still in Yoda's data drive, so he started from the signal origin and tracked it down, following a few more conversations with the Naboo guard. Yoda's journey brought him across the city, to a completely different district. The Palpatine Manor was in the wealthier part of the city, whereas the Gungan stayed close to the water. Due to the disputes between the two planetary populations, it was probably safer for the aquatic man to remain closer to the water, so that he didn't drop any concern despite being a Jedi. When Yoda reached the riverfront, he crossed a bridge and found the building the Jedi transmitted from. It was an abandoned structure, more or less construction that had gone wrong. It was broken apart, and the label on the outside of the structure stressed that no one enter. Yoda examined the signs on the building and read something peculiar. It was property of Damask Holdings, a popular banker from Megiddo. The Grandmaster certainly wasn't one to question buying habits of the social elite, but Naboo was an odd choice, and it was an even wider selection for the Gungan Jedi Master to be at. Why would he go to an abandoned building, controlled by one of the wealthiest men in the northern half of the galaxy? That was asking for trouble for everyone. But because the individual last transmitted from the ruins, Yoda had to take a look himself. He used his smaller frame to slip under some of the outlining fences and into the courtyard. Bricks and screws were lying about, with tools strewn around. No one had been here in a while, it seemed. Yoda could see a fountain that was under construction at one point. The weird thing is, the architecture in this specific structure reminded him of the kinds he'd see back where the manor was located. While yes, all of Naboo was Space Italy, there were some defining factors for the different districts. Wealthier districts typically had finer detailing on the courtyard ornaments, whereas the middle-class areas refrained from having ornaments or even chiseled bricks. Yoda walked quietly around the fountain, looking into his still unfinished pool. Nothing stuck out to him. He stopped and his eyes traced the outline of the structure. He didn't see any cameras on his first arrival. The result was still the same. Interesting. Yoda assumed that someone as wealthy as Hago Damas II would be dedicated to maintaining privacy. He could sue anyone into the ground, so trespassers could pay. But Yoda did recall a conversation he held with the banker about him allowing adventurous adults to visit his under-construction properties, as long as they didn't stay, break anything, or there were no structural problems, because he didn't want anyone getting hurt. Yoda ventured further into the area and found a completely finished interior behind walls of scaffolding. Everything was lit well. There were torches on the walls, fine art pieces standing next to the delicately crafted pillars. This building wasn't under construction, it was already finished. He scanned the room some more before seeing a gash of a lightsaber in the wall. On that instant, he pulled his Jedi weapon into his hand and continued further into the building, without igniting it. His next few steps had him tapping his own homing beacon, just in case something happened to him. Moments later, he could hear a man's voice cut through the silence. He called someone his apprentice, and prided him for his work. Yoda followed the voices and peered around the corner to see a young boy kneeling before a mun, with his back facing the apprentice. The hooded man turned around, placing a cloak around the boy's shoulders and revealing a new name for the apprentice, Sidious. The robes around Palpatine's back and shoulders were maroon and purple. It was a unique color combination, but it seemed to fit the boy. His long and flowing orangish red hair was tied up behind his head, and the Sith Lord in an instant ignited his saber. The boy fell to the side in terror as Plagueis' tone changed. The fatherly, caring overseer transformed into a monstrous Sith Lord. Yoda looked at the crimson weapon, and before he could make a run to inform the council of what he had seen, Plagueis called him by name. Yoda stepped out from the shadows and readied his weapon, demanding to know the truth. Plagueis chuckled to himself, pointing at Yoda so that Palpatine could see the Grand Master in all of his foolishness. Plagueis directly insulted the Jedi Master, telling his new apprentice that their hubris would be their downfall. This was Lesson 1, how to kill a Jedi and keep it a secret. Without much explanation, Yoda understood the stakes. He had found the first Sith seen since the fall of Darth Bane, but it was clear to Yoda that this wasn't technically the first interaction between Palpatine and Plagueis. The Sith Lord had been interweaving his theories and plans into Sheev's mind. Palpatine fell for it, and as a result, he killed his family. Yoda could see the hint of regret on the student's face. Maybe it was just terror. He knew what he could do, but first, Yoda needed to defeat the Sith Lord. The two avatars of light and dark sized each other up. Plagueis had been waiting for this moment his entire life, and Yoda was, like the Jedi Gungan, caught in the dark. Plagueis then revealed the Gungan's lightsaber, telling Yoda that once he died, his new apprentice would be able to choose from two weapons. A clear taunt, but a realistic one at that. Sheev could still be saved. Yoda rolled his saber in his hand, and the two warriors paced around in a circle. Nothing could be said, neither had anything to share. Plagueis focused solely on victory, and Yoda tried to decipher a trick to defeating the Sith Lord and freeing the child in one go. Before resolution could be found, Plagueis lunged across the chamber. Yoda leapt through the air and deflected the strike. He bounced around the room, with Plagueis jabbing at the ground to slow his attack. The two absolute masters of either side of combat fought each other. Plagueis had recently disposed of his own master, becoming the one and only Sith Lord. Their sabers dragged across their bodies, slashing and stabbing. Yoda's speed and agility was surprising, and even slightly frightening to Plagueis. He easily avoided the strikes, but he had to admit his own thrill in the moment. He backed away, batting a saber into Yoda's aggressive strikes, before switching forms to swing at the Jedi Master. Yoda moved into defensive form, focusing on a combined form of Surisu with his main form. Yoda slipped attacks made by Plagueis, and the Sith Lord laughed through each of his fluid moves. Even with their purely opposite sizes, they were impossibly perfect for each other. Plagueis towered over the average human, and Yoda wasn't much bigger than an Azellan. They just matched what the other gave. Plagueis spun over Yoda, and the Grandmaster slipped across the ground, rolling and readying his saber. The Sith Lord jabbed downwards just for Yoda to leap up at him. Plagueis backed his head back, avoiding Yoda's strike with the length of his body, and ripping his hands backwards. Yoda avoided what he thought to be a punch, but it quickly transformed against him, blasting electricity across his body and lobbing him through the air and into a pillar. Yoda dropped to the ground and pulled his saber with the force. He slowly got to his feet, but Plagueis was on top of him, swinging and spinning. Yoda tried to be everything he could, but he vastly underestimated his Sith opponent. Plagueis had none of that. He was on a power high after killing Tenebras, and Yoda was left with the aftermath. Another swing knocked Yoda's saber from his hand, and another burst of electricity forced the Grandmaster to his knees. The last thing Yoda saw were the eager eyes of an apprentice that slaughtered his family, not more than 48 hours before. When more members of the Jedi Council arrived on Naboo to investigate what they initially thought they were coming here for, the Gungan communication, they rushed to the location of Yoda's homing beacon. At their arrival, though, they didn't see a building with fences around it. Instead, they saw nothing but debris, a structure that had been leveled to the ground, awaiting proper building permits so that a new manor could be constructed in its place. The Sith, his new apprentice, and his prisoner were nowhere to be seen. This left the present Jedi with questions about the fate of their Grand Master. Yoda, on the other hand, would be surprised to wake up ever again. He never thought that after his defeat, he would breathe another breath. His vision was blurry when his eyes opened, and his heart strained. He'd been through a lot, but most of it felt like a distant memory. He wasn't anywhere he recognized. There were traces of snow and a sharp breeze, which was a stark contrast of the humid, tropic-like temperatures of Naboo. The warm air compared to the chill of this mysterious snow world forced shivers down Yoda's body. He looked around himself, hoping to find something to wrap himself with. A booming voice congratulated him on surviving Naboo. Plagueis dropped a cape just beyond the cage for Yoda to get it. The young Palpatine followed, just behind his new master. Yoda reached for the cape, only for the cage to shock him. When he tried to use the Force, he was shocked again. Plagueis looked to Palpatine and told his student that this was power. The greatest Jedi seen in the last 700 years of Jedi history was powerless against them. They had all the control in this relationship. But because Plagueis needed Yoda alive for just a little while longer, he released the restraints and dropped the cape into the enclosure. Yoda wrapped his body with thick fur and shook with chills sprouting out of him every few moments. Plagueis patted Sidious on the shoulder and explained to his student that this was the power of the dark side, the power that they, the Sith, controlled. The galaxy was theirs to manipulate. As he was capable of murdering his entire family, he should be also capable of controlling the minds and wills of those weaker than he. Plagueis needed proof of Sidious's ability to use the dark side. The slaughter of the Palpatine family had already done that, but this, controlling a Jedi, was much different. As Plagueis had specifically depicted, he could kill any Jedi Knight or Master with ease. The Gungan warrior was nothing but another show of force. The Jedi were far weaker than the Sith in every single lesson of the Force. Their quest for greater power was created by a hubris of control they believed they had over the galaxy and the Republic. So for young Palpatine, his first lessons with the Jedi were one, that they could be easily killed, but that secondly, they could and should be controlled. Yoda wouldn't have anything positive to give anyone here. His political influence meant nothing, locked up in a cell in Megiddo. But the lesson for Palpatine was to see that he could strip the Jedi of their sense of power. If he could metaphorically determine what a Jedi could or could not do, then it strips them of their mysticism, not just for the Sith, but for the people of the galaxy. Palpatine may have seen the great and powerful Master Yoda wielding his lightsaber, but without that, what is he? Without the gift of the Force or his control over a laser sword, he was nothing but ordinary. The Sith can be broken down to that same mindset, but they wouldn't, because they learned where the Jedi refused to. Sheev watched Plagueis explain these lessons, before following his master away from the enclosure to begin their Sith training. Yoda recognized that he had become nothing but a tool for Sidious and Plagueis. He would die here, in this cell, alone, if he didn't do anything. He was a fool for going into that construction site alone, and this was his burden to pay. He needed to figure a way out of this, or it would be the end of his life. The Sith had returned and no one would know. The Jedi Council wouldn't understand his disappearance or that of the Jedi before him. They would just know that they were gone, and assume a brash vow or just overall lack of interest in being a Jedi took over. It had happened before, so that would be the logical assumption. He hoped that Master Terra Sunube would be willing to begin an investigation. Sunube had always been a bit more of a detective, despite his current seat on the council. Yoda could only hope that someone could change the trajectory of his circumstances or what would eventually face the Order and galaxy. Instead of letting his own doubts wash over him, he crossed his legs, tugged the cape tighter around him, and closed his eyes. Despite what Plagueis taught Palpatine, the Grand Master wasn't going to use the Force outwards. He learned his lesson. Instead of trying to break free, he'd find harmony. If he died here, then he needed to find his peace. If not, then he needed to be ready to escape. Later that same evening, after minor discussions regarding Grandmaster Yoda transpired on Coruscant, the Jedi Master had a visitor. Yoda was wide awake. He didn't know it, but he was knocked unconscious for nearly 48 hours. He missed a lot, and now he was spending his time meditating. It was the best and perhaps only thing for him to do in this scenario. He quietly felt through the Force inside of himself. He pulled on memories and lessons from his life. If Yoda pushed the Force outwards, he might be shocked again. But this was far from that. He simply searched for peace. It would solidify him as a Jedi Master, as what he was. Though all of these thoughts and calming feelings were disrupted when a boy's voice cut into his mind. The kid asked what he was doing, and Yoda opened his eyes to see the 10 or so year old Palpatine looking into his cell. The wounded Grand Master readjusted himself. Just as he exited his meditation to this surprising guest, he was whacked with the whiplash of every sense he had submerged while visiting his inner conscience. Inside his head, he didn't feel the cold, and upon returning, he felt it rush his body. His hand clenched his cape, and he questioned the boy. Why was he here? Sheev looked at the green figure and then thought for a moment. Curiosity was the answer, but he didn't have the words to describe it as that. Even with the power and the corruption that the dark side can capture you with, there remains but one draw away from it: curiosity. Sheev was experiencing that, because he embarked on a pathway to learn what the Sith considered unnatural abilities. But Yoda had another version of the Force. He had answers to questions that Plagueis could not reply to. The two of them sat silently across from each other, and Yoda leaned up, asking the boy what he wanted to know. What secrets did the Force did his master hide from him? It absolutely was subtle, but Yoda, despite his condition, understood the key to survival. He needed to gaslight Palpatine in the most generous tone as possible. Of course, Plagueis couldn't tell him everything, but being that Yoda was in such a precarious position, what is he to do but give Palpatine what he wanted? Sheev lowered himself to the ground and crossed his legs too. He asked to know about what Yoda was doing. Sheev had been watching him for almost 10 minutes, and Yoda was as still as a statue. What was that? Yoda explained in a more mystical way that he was harmonizing with the Force. He had to tread carefully with his words, but he explained that what he did was feel the flow of the Force and simply join it on its natural trajectory. Yoda asked what Palpatine felt through the Force, and there was a sense of conflict, not because Sheev feared turning towards darkness, but because darkness in of itself is in conflict with the Force. The Force is naturally light. It beckons that its users follow that pathway. Palpatine's murder of his family and subsequent uses of the dark side were directly against that. Yoda mentioned what his meditation gave him. It produced a series of understandings, questions he wanted to know the answers to. Not everything was truly given, but what he desired most was. Palpatine inquired more about what Yoda wanted most, and the Grand Master smiled, leaning closer to the cage and asking the Sith apprentice if he had ever experienced a vision. Palpatine explained similar dreamlike scenarios, and Yoda moved from there, describing the spirituality, the comfort, and peace that came with his meditation. Yoda was nearly 900 years old. He had a full life behind him, so many lessons he could draw off of. Sheev was impressed with the insane age capabilities, but that was really all that could be shared. Palpatine gave the Jedi Master his food and departed from the enclosure to meet with Plagueis for more lessons. Even though the motivations weren't entirely present, and Yoda reasonably assumed that Plagueis was watching Palpatine's every move, he assumed that Sheev was searching for answers. Yoda put the pieces together. Sheev murdered his entire family, after having been promised something by Plagueis, and maybe that story wasn't fully lined up, but it was close enough. Whatever Palpatine was searching for, he had not found it, and impatience was getting the best of him. He desired immediate results, and Yoda was forced to focus on the most efficient way to give that young Sith whatever he wanted. Maybe it would result in his own death, but it could also help Yoda free himself if Palpatine started to trust him. The next week or so would have Palpatine and Plagueis, separately or together, interacting with Yoda. While yes, Plagueis kept his new apprentice on a tight leash, he wasn't as distrusting as many other Bainite Sith. Plagueis the Wise was very determined to create a Sith lineage that existed unselfishly. So Palpatine may have been young and even adventurous, but he wasn't constantly monitored, because Plagueis was attempting to create a line of trust. Yoda served him in many ways. He was such a useful prisoner, especially because Plagueis didn't mean to kill the Gungan. His long neck got in the way of the Sith Lord's saber. Regardless, what became the talking point for Yoda and Palpatine was the Force. Plagueis was still working through his alchemic rituals, and while he did teach Palpatine a great deal about the great power, it was in moderation, because of how powerful Sidious could become. At his young age, giving him too much knowledge could make him a detriment to himself. Sidious could never hurt Plagueis at this age, but Palpatine wanted more, and Yoda started to indulge in that. These conversations between Jedi Master and Sith Apprentice were deep and philosophical. Yoda knew he could never convince someone who just murdered their entire family to see the light from the interior of a cell, so he focused more on the philosophies of the Force, how spirituality played into everything, and how someone of Yoda's size, despite losing to Plagueis, could go toe-to-toe with him. Palpatine became intrigued in this concept of a small creature having such potential. Yoda acted less like a Jedi, and more like a rogue, a shadow, or even a Boken Jedi. These splinter groups of the sect were still all true Jedi, but they didn't hold the proper demeanor of a counselor. Palpatine became so enamored with learning from Yoda and Plagueis. They both had so much knowledge to offer, and it was these late-night discussions with Yoda that led to a really peculiar incident. Palpatine freed Yoda on the condition that Yoda would return to his cell. It was a huge judgment call on both of their parts, but Yoda would step out of his cell and instruct Palpatine on how to use the specific force power he spoke about. Palpatine would listen to the instructions and eventually perfect it, and Yoda, true to his word, probably even stupid to it, walked back into the enclosure and allowed Palpatine to lock the door. The young Sith apprentice had so many ways to interpret Yoda's actions. Either he was so confident in his knowledge that he would just bestow it to an enemy, or he believed that Palpatine would change, or the other option was he was just stupid. Sheev was too young to know which, and he didn't exactly ask Plagueis. Palpatine wanted more, and no one would stop him. It's why, when Yoda helped him find it, he started building more of a connection. Plagueis' concern for Palpatine's focused regiment of development and Yoda's ironically radical approach to instruction led the child killer to be more interested in the Grand Master. But that full week would have Plagueis catching on, and as a form of punishment, Sidious would watch Yoda electrocuted for nearly 20 minutes. There were some breaks, and it fueled Palpatine's rage, yet the satisfaction that led to the death of House Palpatine was all but gone. The Sith apprentice wanted to enjoy the moment, to take part in the satisfaction, but there was nothing. And it wasn't because of mercy. It was due to Palpatine's desire to grow and prove himself. In the fight between masters, Yoda lost fair and square. Just like how Sheev murdered his family as a child, he won that engagement on an even playing field. But this torture, it made the Sith appear weak to him. Yoda was larger than life as a cell dweller, and Plagueis, despite towering over doorways, felt minuscule even after victory. As a result, after almost being killed by Plagueis, Palpatine would unlock Yoda's cell while he was incapacitated and leave. The Jedi Master wouldn't realize that he could break out of the cell until the following day, when he returned to full consciousness. Plagueis and Sidious avoided Yoda's enclosure for that entire day anyways, a punishment if you will. First the electrocution, then starvation and dehydration. It was the perfect way to depict their control over the Grand Master. Yoda, accidentally, realized that the cell was opened. He pushed it ever so slightly when he removed his cape, due to overheating following the burning. When he felt healthy enough to exit, he did. Thanks to Sheev, Yoda was able to retrieve his lightsaber and begin his escape. But then it dawned on him. He had a chance to end the Sith in one go, and even if he failed, the effect it would have on young Palpatine could forever change his life. There were doubts, absolutely. While Sheev was fully imbued by darkness and followed Plagueis' instructions to murder his family, Yoda promised power faster, because the Sith Lord was more methodical in his approach to instruction. This false promise from Yoda could rupture the relationship if he survived, but in the end, he never really anticipated surviving. In the middle of a training session with his apprentice, Plagueis would be interrupted by Yoda once again. In a way mirroring their duel on Naboo, they readied their weapons, but Plagueis realized that only Yoda could have escaped through Palpatine and quickly electrocuted his apprentice, launching Sheev across the room. The boy wasn't knocked out, but he was badly hurt from the attack. He looked up to watch just in time as Emerald and Crimson connected again. Yoda spun around, wounded in his form, but more wary of his opponent this time. He struck at Plagueis and flipped around out of forms rapidly. Plagueis knew that he could break his opponent with just a matter of time. It was, yet again, another role reversal. Yoda had to be the impatient warrior due to his drained energy from the past week and a half of solitary confinement, whereas the Sith Lord could patiently wait out his opponent. While these role reversals put the Jedi and Sith into weird situations respectively in this duel, it left a lasting impression on Darth Sidious, who watched their weapons slam together. Yoda didn't jump through the air as much, focusing on his force barrier to protect himself. Plagueis tried to slice through his defense, but couldn't land a strike on his opponent's body. Yoda used the environment around him, leaping off pillars when he could, forcing Plagueis to cut through some artifacts and the structure's security. The base of the building was ripped up, not enough to drop the office on their heads, but enough to make it buckle in the wind. Yoda shoved fire from the nearby torches at Plagueis, and he defended himself. Electricity was shot at the Grand Master, but he slyly avoided it. They were back at the fight again, not more than half a month having passed by, and still interlocking as if they had done this dance 100 times and again. As Plagueis predicted though, Yoda started to grow tired. Even without flipping and jumping as much as he could have, he couldn't keep up with himself or his opponent. Plagueis waited Yoda out and began his own aggressive assault. He struck and sliced, and eventually with one powerful blow, he threw Yoda from his feet into the Sith altar. It swayed but stood tall. Palpatine pushed himself up, but Plagueis told his apprentice to stand down and not move a muscle. The Sith apprentice nodded his head as he watched Plagueis stand above Yoda. He didn't villain monologue about the Jedi or the Sith. He just raised his saber, and the moment he swung up and dropped his blade, the altar was lifted up from behind Yoda and thrown into Plagueis' robes. The black fire ripped across his chest, and Yoda looked at Palpatine, whose face scrunched up in anger. The tale of Plagueis the Wise would finalize itself in arrogance. Yoda spun his saber and leapt into the air, pushing the emerald blade through the raging black fire and into Plagueis' chest. The Sith Lord fell to his knees, and Yoda leapt backwards, throwing another Sith torch onto Plagueis' face, burning him across his body. He yelled out in agony until those cries were silenced by Palpatine shoving the Sith Lord's own weapon through his back. But Yoda wasn't free yet. Sheev told the Jedi Master to not make him regret sparing his life, and Yoda promised that he never would. The duo, within the next few hours, would get transport off of Megiddo and have a swift return to the Jedi Temple. Yoda was in a lot of pain and struggling to stay awake, but he did everything in his power to escort Palpatine to his new home on Coruscant. The Jedi were told about him and all of his wounds. The Sith had been trying to corrupt him for long enough, but Palpatine was just a case of a little push. He really didn't need a whole lot of extra motivation to start murdering family members. The Jedi were especially cautious, because Palpatine was in fact a former Sith, and murdered his entire family. But Yoda, even before returning to a medically induced coma for his injuries, told the Jedi Council that the Sith could not be killed by bloodshed. If Palpatine was the last of them, then they needed to transform him into a Jedi. Ironically, and as weird as it might seem, many Jedi considered Yoda the chosen one for centuries. Now with Palpatine, he was seen as the new chosen one, the individual to bring balance to the Force, the Sith that could become a Jedi. But Palpatine's powers came with serious baggage, and the High Council needed to resolve it. They divided their members up into separate regiments of instruction, so that Palpatine could be trained properly, and have advanced training as Yoda promised. For an individual who experienced the highs of the dark side, they needed him to understand the gift of the light, so in a very un-Jedi-like way, they would instruct him at an elite level. He'd be given instructions in Vapad and Juyo instead of starting with Form 1. He'd receive experienced lessons from counselors and elders around the temple, focused on power, and the interesting thing about this direction is it awarded the Jedi a chance to make the dark side look weak by comparison. There were hundreds of powers that a Jedi could use that eclipsed the greatest thing Palpatine ever saw Plagueis do. The mythos that would have given the Sith Lord the title of Plagueis the Wise was never experienced by Palpatine. So when the Jedi showed him powers of Force heal, projection, and even told him the concept of opening up black holes with the Force, he became enamored. The more he learned, the less he desired. As Palpatine grew up around a highly focused Jedi Order, he stopped holding great rage and anger. It still existed within him, but Master Windu's lessons coaxed him out of remaining a full-blown maniac. However, even with the Sith dead, it didn't resolve the issues at large. The Federation would never be ballsy enough to blockade Naboo, but they'd try their luck in other ways with Valorum's administration, and pay the price for it. The Republic would descend into a political civil war without the clones, and simply eventually slip into a recession, before bouncing back with new tax laws on mega corporations. The would-be Sith Lord, Chief Palpatine on the other hand, progressed through the Jedi ranks. With allies in his corner, ranging from Dooku to Yoda, he always had something to learn from. Keeping Palpatine's mind preoccupied for the first few years of his Jedi training is what kept him in the light. Without that dedicated focus, he may have fallen back to the dark side, but Yoda's ability to show love for someone capable of change became the saving grace for a galaxy so close to creating a monster. And that, my friends, is our twisted story. And special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Let's talk about this story. So this one, I kind of wanted to go a little bit more of a prison I wanted this to be a more intimate story, just a few key individuals interacting with each other, Yoda, Plagueis, Palpatine. I thought having Yoda and Plagueis interact with Yoda at such a young age would be a very unique way to handle the growth of like the Sith Order, and obviously how Palpatine becomes Sidious. I really wanted to role reverse Yoda and Plagueis in this story a lot. Both of them are going to feel a little bit like the inverse, like Plagueis is acting more like a refined Jedi Master, Yoda's being a little bit more open with the whole concept of training. I thought that it would make sense for Palpatine specifically to be enamored with the Jedi because the Jedi are promising some sense of power, and that's what Yoda's really doing. He's kind of just flipping the script. Yoda traditionally would not do that, but in the circumstance he's in, he's kind of forced to. I thought that having Palpatine kind of see Yoda in a weak state would be probably the most challenging thing for him to see value in the Jedi, but I also think that Palpatine as an impatient learner would be something that Yoda could use against him. I really love the idea, and it is, as I say in the story, it is really like kind of stupid of Yoda, because Palpatine does break him out, and he could theoretically kill Palpatine or escape. But I really love the idea of Yoda being a true Jedi and true to his word and not actually lying, because he doesn't theoretically lie to Palpatine. Palpatine wants to learn something specific, Yoda teaches it to him, and that moment, I believe, is the moment that Palpatine kind of rejects the Jedi. That moment where he knows he can trust someone with so much power and someone who could easily just throw him off the platform. I think that moment really is the only reason why this works. It's Palpatine freeing Yoda to learn something about the Force, Yoda teaching him and then returning to his enclosure. Is it incredibly stupid? Probably. Because, Yoda doesn't know if Palpatine's gonna kill him, but he's kind of like, and it said at the end of the story is that the last of the Sith shouldn't be killed through bloodshed. That'll never end it because they're gonna keep returning. And so instead, it's killed with love, basically. And Palpatine ends up becoming the quote-unquote chosen one. He is the chosen one in this story. He brings balance to the Force by ending the Sith and making the conscious decision to remain a Jedi. And while it is selfish at first, it eventually becomes one out of of true value and true acceptance of their order. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.